Oh, so you're not going to run it. You're going to...
no, I'm not running. We're doing the normal intro, and we are here discussing part 2 of this fella here, Frank Sturgis.
Your sound is a little watery. If you ask the people in the chat, maybe they can help you.
Okay. Folks, how's my sound in the chat? Just let me know. And
They like it?
I don't know yet. I'm waiting for people to roll in.
Right. Well, they're hitting the bong. They got to do the bong first, and then the shots, and then get the electroshock therapy.
It could be.
In the meantime, we could try to resolve stuff about Frank Sturgis. So it's kind of like the guy should have been a movie star, I think, because he goes to Paris Island and he's training with a guy named Tyrone Power. And then later he runs into Burt Lancaster on that movie Scorpio, and I think E. Howard Hunt runs into Alain Delon, the French star who was in the movie. He talked about it in the elevator. So both of them in their memoirs talk about running into people from the CIA thriller Scorpio, which I have yet to receive in the mail.
Weird.
Yeah. But we're trying to resolve his father, right? Was that where we left? Where did we leave off?
We never talked about his father. You mentioned his father when you said, "Hey, we need to do more.
We need to figure this out." But yeah, the father. It's a stepfather, by the way. It's not his father. The stepfather is oddly named Sturgis, and Ralph Sturgis, but he doesn't change his name to Sturgis. This is Frank Fiorini, the Italian, who, by the way, in the New York Times, in his obituary in 1993, lists him as Cuban American. And because of that, the paper of record, everybody believed, because it was 1993 and it was the New York Times, again, infallible, that he was Cuban. And in fact, he was Italian. And this will come up a little bit later, because both him and Judge Sirica, John Sirica, come from Italian working class background, and both were Golden Glove boxing champs as kids, as young teens. And Sirica and him have a lot in common, and it's not being Cuban; it's Italian working class roots. But his sister, and this happens occasionally that you hear this in among people. His sister dies in a fire, so the mother is insufferable and gets divorced from the father, the biological father, and then moves in. You know what I mean? You hear these things where a child dies and the couple divorces. Because
one of two ways. They either get closer together, or they blow them apart. And usually the closer they are before the child dies, the more likely they get divorced. But if they're distant from each other, sometimes
they could come together. Right. Yeah. Well, this case, they went apart, and the mother moves in with her parents, kind of like what my mother did. We moved in with her parents, and they became my parents. She became like my sister because she was only like 18 when she had me as a child, or 18 and 19. So she, because of the societal structure within the house, her parents became my parents, and she became their daughter, theoretically, and because she was moving back in with the parents. So in this case, his mother moves in with her parents with him in Philadelphia. They leave Norfolk. You're
getting there.
Norfolk, Virginia.
Just Norfolk.
I'm done. I said it 11 times. So they move in with the mother and the grandparents in Philadelphia, where he's raised for 20 years until 1942 when he goes to war. But in that period of time, in 1952, and you say, well, why is this important? It's bizarre. That's why it's important, because in 1952, he legally changes his name to Frank Sturgis, right? So it turns out,
an adult at the time, or
yeah, he's an adult. That's right, 1952. So, well, I don't know. He's in his teens. Put it this way: he's in his teens. because he's 17 when he's born in 1924. So 34, 44, he's 20. So 42, he's 18. So 1952 is when he changes it, Eric. So he's an adult, right?
Okay, and it could have been disrespected.
No, right. Well, the same thing happened in my family. Nevertheless, the point of the matter is he still goes by Frank Fiorini. So he doesn't change the relationship of the name, but legally he does change it to Frank Sturgis. It's legal. The reason it's bizarre, as we began to discuss, Eric and I off air, is because in 1949, E. Howard Hunt, Eduardo, as his CIA handler name among everyone was, writes this book called Bimini Run, and the lead character in the book is Hank Sturgis. This will become interesting because it's 1949. E. Howard Hunt, by the way, when we get into Hunt, we're going to get into his literary career, which is not like David Atlee Phillips, who writes Night Watch as a novel after he's done with the CIA. Hunt comes from literature. He wins awards as a writer before the CIA. He's in newspapers before the CIA. Hunt is the real deal in terms of being a writer. But he claims, and Fiorini claimed, that they didn't know each other until Watergate, Eric. Why they lied about this, no one knows, because Hunt on his deathbed said that he knew Sturgis from the Bay of Pigs. And everybody else said they knew each other from the Bay of Pigs, except for the two of them. And nobody can explain why. That being said, the 1949 novel by E. Howard Hunt, Bimini Run, is the featured character is a guy exactly like Frank Sturgis named Hank Sturgis. But he denies it, and he says this is the other version of the book, Bimini Run, which is, a action, adventure, spy novel involving Pulp Fiction, right, yeah. A little bit above that because it gets reviewed by the New York Times and gets awards. This is a little bit above Pulp Fiction. So the reality of it is that Sturgis is a enigma in terms of his name and how his character became Frank Sturgis because of Hank Sturgis. And everyone presumed that it was because of the novel until I learned what we're discussing now, that he doesn't change his name and that his father is Ralph Sturgis, the stepfather. So I'm completely baffled at this point.
I think that he could have been using the name, though, like as a working name. And, like when he goes undercover on missions or whatever, he just throws out, "Oh, I'm Frank Sturgis." And then later.
Well, he had 30 aliases. He didn't need Frank Sturgis. He had Frank Hamilton. Frank Hamilton is who he claims to be when he's arrested at Watergate. He's got 25 other aliases. They're a dime a dozen. He doesn't need Frank Sturgis. The fact that this guy, Hank Sturgis, I think it came from that Hunt knew Frank Fiorini, and he somehow usurped the name. He knew about the stepfather. That's my take on it. He knew that he was living with the Sturgis family. That's the easiest solution to the problem. I mean, keep in mind, Hunt is also CIA, will later become his boss indirectly on these missions, including the Bay of Pigs, of which all of them are involved in the Bay of Pigs. As Sturgis says, we knew each other for 30 years after Watergate. I mean, they knew Bernard Barker, a.k.a. Macho, was the direct boss to Sturgis, and Barker's boss was E. Howard Hunt, a.k.a. Eduardo. So when they get together to do the burglaries, they all knew each other. The only guy they didn't know was James McCord, who he will go into, we'll get to that later, but he went into incredible detail. Both Hunt and Sturgis said that McCord was a spy, a double agent. And McCord was the one who did them in and screwed them over to get caught intentionally during the Watergate break-in. And there's a lot of evidence to agree with Frank Sturgis and Hunt about McCord. McCord was the only one they didn't know. McCord was mysteriously disappearing during both break-ins. McCord had a lot to answer for. and he writes there he is, the weasel. He writes the famous McCord letter to Judge Sirica that breaks open the case. Now, Sturgis, who passes every single test with flying colors, the probation officer says he was a war hero. He has no criminal record. He's psychologically sound. They give him the Minnesota multiphasic personality test. He passes that with flying colors. He has a wife and a stepdaughter with his wife, has a family life, and yet Sirica sentences him to 50 years in prison. 50 years, Eric, for a botched burglary. I mean, we'll get to that eventually when we get to Sirica and we get to the break-in. But Sturgis was stunned. This guy is insane. Sirica is. When we do an episode on Judge Sirica, you're going to see that this madman, how maniacal and megalomaniacal this guy was, a complete psychopath. He turns himself into the prosecution in the case, and he says they pled guilty. I mean, it was an open and shut case, and he wouldn't accept their guilty pleas. He said, I want to know why you did it. And Frank Sturgis says, I did it because they brought me in under national security orders from the White House. He says, what do you want from me? I was just doing what they said. I didn't, it's not like I woke up and burglarized a jewelry store. He said that these were my supervisors, Eric. And he was right. He was right. I'm sorry, you were going to say something?
I agree. Yes.
No, right. Yeah. When you start to read the lawyers' correspondence with the people who hire them and with Sirica, and you realize how rigged this thing is, they can't even plead their way out of this mess. At one point, the guy says, we're going to take this type of defense in this case to Sirica. And he says, I'm not going to allow that. Find another defense. And the guy goes, what? He goes, yeah, that's not a good enough defense. I'm going to disallow that defense. Thank you for coming by. Just crazy, crazy, crazy. But let's back up to the war years, because that's what I wanted to show you a little bit about Frank Fiorini training at Quantico, Virginia. And you say, why Quantico? They formed this group that we touched on last week called the Raiders, the Marine Raiders. It will later be disbanded because the Marines were fed up with having a submarine, a subgroup in the Marines that were claiming to be even better than the Marines, if that makes any sense, Eric. The Marine Raiders, I don't know if you have their logo. They had their own special logo. This was under Red Mike. 1st Battalion were 8-man squads, and they created these 8-man squads for a reason. They were going to go behind enemy lines. They trained on how to use rubber boats on the Potomac River, by the way, across from Quantico. That's where they did their training in 1941. And they're trained to kill. And like I said, they were trained under the Donovan OSS paradigm on how to operate behind enemy lines. Their battle cry, by the way, ironically enough, their battle cry was gung ho. And I learned that gung ho means work together in Chinese. Did you know this?
No idea of that.
Right. I had no idea. That was on their uniform, on their badge, or whatever they had. And he goes over there and he gets involved in 1943, coming right out of the gate. He sees action in New Caledonia, Guadalcanal, Georgia Islands, the Samoan Islands. He's wounded twice. He jumps ship, the hospital ship, twice to get back to his men. Literally goes overboard because if you're wounded, you can get sent back to the United States. He's wounded twice, Purple Hearts. He is learning how to kill behind enemy lines in the jungle. And he jumps ship twice, the hospital ship, to get back to his men in the jungle.
Crazy.
I don't know if you have any. Oh yeah, there's their that's their banner, or whatever you want to call it, of the Marine Raiders in 1942, 1st Battalion. And again, these were small groups of 8 men that would be dropped in rubber boats on islands. He is then, like I said last week, he begins to he gets sent to Europe when he comes back. He he goes to Berlin, where he's in the honor guard of General Lucius Clay. And the reason that's important is not so much because of Lucius Clay, but Frank Fiorini gets honeypotted. Honeypotted? I don't know if that's a verb, but he gets honeypotted by this stunning Hungarian Jewish actress who is Haganah in 1948, working for the fledgling state of Israel. And he begins to help her in her spy mission in the quadrants of Berlin, the 4 quadrants. And as you know, the whole Cold War was centered in Berlin at that time, with the French and the British and American zones, Eric, and then the Russian zone was the 4th zone. So this Hungarian was involved in procuring documents that would help, and I don't know what they are, and Frank never explained it, but he helped her with his intelligence background on how to procure these documents, and admitted that he was honeypotted and enjoyed it, but did the spying with her anyway, and knew her for many, many years. He never gave her name, but it was some named Hungarian actress. I've never been able to really find out who it was. But when he comes back from overseas in World War II, he, like we said last week, he begins to work for the Norfolk Police Department. He uncovers the corruption there. He quits in protest, and he begins to get some wanderlust, Eric. And the wanderlust, these are the men in, I think, New Caledonia. This is part of his group of Marine raiders under Red Mike. That's Merritt Edson, as we showed last week. But the weird thing is that this is disbanded as a segment of the Marines. They weren't happy when it was created, and they were more than happy to get rid of it. And I think they get rid of it in 1943, 44, very quickly. It only lasts a couple of years because they felt the Marines were tough enough to do this job by themselves without having a subunit of the Marines, if that makes any, from anything I've read, that's the closest explanation I can give to why the Marines did not like this, and also why they got rid of it. So he goes on this wanderlust trip to Cuba, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras. He goes all through Central America journeying, and he has a Cuban aunt or sister-in-law, I forget what it is. And in Miami is a guy named Prio. And Prio was the previous president before Batista. And Prio is willing to put up about $50,000. As we said, this is Prio. He was willing to write a check to Frank and some men to begin to do stuff against Batista. So Frank ends up in the mountains, literally fighting with Che Guevara and the legendary Fidel Castro. Now, Fidel Castro, just so people don't know, who don't know this, Fidel Castro is a lawyer. And he sued Batista on numerous levels. And all of the levels that he sued him on were rebuffed because, like today, the administration controlled the court system in Cuba. All of the legitimate lawsuits, a violation of civil liberties, violation of human rights, violation of free speech, all of the things that Castro sued Batista for were kicked out of court because Batista controlled the entire judicial system of the island of Cuba. It sounds vaguely familiar to today. You wouldn't be far off. So Castro famously says the only way, this is Batista, right? Yeah, the only way we're going to get any justice is from the barrel of a gun. And it's not like he just picked up the gun willy-nilly. He literally tried to do this legally through the court system to no avail. So he's in Mexico City in exile, kind of, and he gets gets a boat called the Granma, and they sail from Mexico to Cuba, and they are decimated by Batista's forces. Of the 81 original, this is the July 26th Brigade, famously where the name comes from historically. I guess it happened on July 26th. there's 81 of them originally sailing from Mexico to topple the Batista government. I think 13 survived. They were shredded by Batista's forces. And of those 13 that went up in the hills, Frank Sturgis was with them. And Frank Sturgis fights alongside Fidel Castro for years until they are victorious. He's also up there with Che Guevara. Now, Che Guevara is an Argentine, as most people know, played by Benicio del Toro, by the way, in a two-part movie called Che, directed by Steven Soderbergh. Beautiful looking movie. If anybody wants to see that, you can see the history of Che Guevara. He will famously go across all through South America and Central America on a 500cc Norton 1939 motorcycle, where he writes the famous Motorcycle Diaries, which becomes another movie. Che Guevara is a doctor, and he hooks up with there's his motorcycle. They will begin to fight together, but Che doesn't know anything about guerrilla activity, but Frank Sturgis does, and Frank Sturgis begins to train the shoeless guerrilla in waiting faction of Castro's army. And this is a photo, I think we showed this last week. This is Castro with Frank Sturgis, just so people know the relationship that these two men had was real. And he was an anti-communist, Frank Sturgis. And what's his face here, bearded Castro, who, by the way, said, this is right, I didn't know this. He said, "I'm not going to shave my beard until we win the revolution." And the reason he never shaved it was because the revolution was in perpetuity, Eric. In other words, right. So, but that's why I didn't know this. That's why we came up with that dirty trick of putting stuff in his beard to make it melt off like Nair, because I didn't understand what that meant. I didn't understand the symbolism of the beard. I didn't know the background until this past week, reading about how he said that, saying the revolution I'll shave my beard when the revolution is over. And they asked him when he took Havana and they got rid of Batista, he said, no, it's just beginning. And that's when they begin executing everyone, as revolutions will have it. And we showed the photo of Sturgis on top of that mass grave. Now, that photo will cause the Immigration Naturalization Services to revoke the citizenship of Frank Sturgis. He will lose his American citizenship, which I didn't know you could do, but apparently you can, because he was fighting for the Cubans and blah, blah, blah. They revoked his American citizenship. Really strange. He will get it back, but I didn't know you could lose it based on what you're doing overseas.
What are you then, though? That's the weird one. It's like, okay, so then are you a Cuban citizen? What?
No, they didn't give a shit. The INS did not care what he was. They just took away his American citizenship. Yeah, I thought the same thing. It is rather confusing as to what his status was. And after he attempts to work with the CIA and kill Castro, which is not that far away, he will have his American citizenship restored.
Again.
What?
He's good with us again.
Yeah, he's good with us again. I don't know. March in 1958, he sets up a training camp to train the rebels in the Sierra Madre Mountains. July 30th, 58, he's arrested at U.S. Customs, running guns. He would go back to Miami. He would fill up his Cadillac. He would take a ferry from Miami to Havana with the guns in the car. That was small change at the beginning. He will then be given money, actually a Swiss bank account code number, to withdraw money given to him by Castro, to withdraw money to go to the United States, which he does. And he buys a B-25 and a C-46 transport plane for quite a large amount of money. The C-46 and the B-29, he buys these with it was about $100,000 or something. Oh, it was $112 for the C-46 and $10K for the B-25. So these are post-World War II planes, Eric, that are laying around. So he buys the two of them, and with this other cat, Enrique, flies him back to Cuba. They're loaded with guns, by the way, when he does fly them back. Now, we mentioned last week that, also that Ruby gets involved in this, and the mob is getting involved in this, and the battle for Havana ends, and Castro is victorious. And what does he do? He gives Frank Sturgis control over the gambling casinos in Havana. This opens the door to the mob coming to see Frank Sturgis about the gambling casinos. There's also a lesbian fighter who was in the group with them, and she's put in charge as the accountant of the casinos by Castro. But he's also put in charge of the Air Force, Frank Sturgis, who's a pilot, as we said, going to Naval Reserve School to learn how to fly, and that's how he flies the B-25 out of Texas, loaded with weapons. I mean, it's just a crazy story that this guy keeps doing this. And at one point, these two guys show up out of nowhere. And this is one of the machine guns that they were able to stockpile. These machine guns, I think, were out of South America or Mexico, a particular style. I forget the name of it, but
Mendoza Bulldogs.
The Mendoza. I think it's a Mexican machine gun, but the people at home may know a little bit more about it than I do. But they believe that Frank Sturgis was killed in the mountains of San Maestro Mountains. But the Philadelphia Inquirer puts him on the front page of the newspaper, not for the first time. This is not an obscure guy. The front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer at one point says, "Local boy alive, still fighting in the mountains in Cuba." I mean, with his picture. So, I mean, he's been in the press quite a bit in his life, even before this. So he keeps running these guns to Castro, and this is him here, triple agent in Havana. At this point, he's a single agent. He's arrested in 1958 running guns again. He's caught by Batista. He's put into El Moro prison, which is one of the harshest prisons in Cuba, and he's bullwhipped repeatedly by Batista's guards with a bullwhip for running guns. Now, in Miami, Batista is known as the hyena. He's despised. So these anti-Batista Cubans, they're not anti-Castro Cubans yet. Just to give you a little historical background. They're anti-Batista, and they live in Miami, and they're pro-Castro, and they're pro-Prio, the former president. Now, Castro is not a commie yet. People believe that he is a straight shooter. He has not become a communist until, this is what happens, he is visited by two communist Venezuelans who bring documents to him, and this is reported by Frank Sturgis to a guy in the embassy in Santiago named Clark Woolan. Clark Woolan is our embassy CIA attaché in the embassy in Santiago de Cuba. He meets with Frank Sturgis, and Frank Sturgis tells him that these two known Venezuelan communists that he takes photos of, and he gives them to the CIA guy at the embassy, U.S. guy. And he says, these two communists showed up with documents, and I'm afraid that Castro is going to switch over to, he hasn't switched because he hasn't endorsed one policy over another, but he feels that Castro is going to turn communist. Now, keep in mind, last week we said he went to New York with Castro. Castro was on Meet the Press. Castro is making the rounds. He's staying at a hotel in Harlem. He's partying. This Marita Lorenz is his lover, the 20-year-old girl who Frank tries to get her to kill him, but she's madly in love with him, which is really what happened. She makes up this story about the poison dissolving in the cold cream, but I think that she just couldn't do it.
Could be. It's a good story. Could be.
It's a great story. She's a pathological liar, according to members of the House Assassinations Committee. They just didn't believe anything she said. So after this meeting with the CIA, he meets with Colonel Nicholas and a Major Van Horn, who are CIA military people down there, and they want to know military stuff about Castro's army, which he's still supporting Castro. He has not abandoned Castro. But he feels, as an American, that he must supply them with information because he's a military guy and they're military guys. So he begins to tell them the nuts and bolts of Castro's army, right? So while this is going on, he literally goes back to the United States and testifies in closed session to the U.S. Senate about Castro. You can't make this up. He's then interviewed in 1959, March 31st, by the FBI. Who in D.C., he goes to D.C. and he tells them about it. He is still running guns to Castro. And like I said, Castro sets up this regime and he begins killing people, and Frank switches sides. And now he's anti-Castro. And that's where this stuff with the CIA comes in and the assassination attempts. And they go to him and they say, how can we kill this guy? He says, well, I think that we can't get a guy to assassinate him. That's not going to work because he'll be immediately killed. But they do find a guy. They go to the mob, and the mob recommends a guy. I forget this guy's name. I never heard of him before. He's a professional hitman for the mob, and he is he's got like 50 hits under his belt. And they hire him to do the hit, but it doesn't work. And I don't know where it went wrong or what happened, but the hit didn't work. And they bring in Johnny Roselli. And Johnny Roselli says, shooting the guy's not going to work. We can't get in there. It's got to be with these poisons or nerve things or these toxins that we discussed. And that's where the Marita Lorenz case happens. Now, Fidel is not sitting pat. Fidel sends 2 assassins to kill Frank Sturgis, who were arrested at the Mexican border because Frank Sturgis knew who they were and gave photos of them to our immigration service at the Mexican border, and they were apprehended there. He also buys he buys 2 45-foot yachts and 2 racing hulls and begins loading weapons into them to take to the rebels to overthrow Castro, if this makes any sense to anybody. And that's also going on with him for the next 50 years. This work.
Johnny Roselli.
This is Roselli. Yeah, Roselli says smartly, we want to get the casinos back. Castro has now kicked them completely out of the casinos. The casinos are closed. And by the way, during this whole time, Frank Sturgis is a registered Democrat. He threw that in one of these articles. He just wanted people to know his political affiliation, I guess. But yeah, he has a death sentence against him by Castro. And this is really great. There is a guy, and I got to find this guy's name. He was the top race car driver. They had planned to put in a Grand Prix race in Havana. This was under Batista. This guy's name, he was an Argentine, and he was the #1 racer in the world.
Juan Manuel Fangio.
Fangio. And he raced Le Mans and all these races. He had 5 world titles or something. And they had planned under Batista to have a race through Havana. And this guy showed up, and Frank and Che and Castro planned to kidnap him, which they did at the Havana Hilton. This is one of the most brazen political stunts. Later on, the PLO will do things, and later on, the Red Brigade, and later on, the Bad Meinhof gang. But nobody had done anything like this before. And they kidnap Fangio, who is so famous, but Fangio gets along with them. Fangio, it turns out, is a Marxist himself, and he has no problem being kidnapped. He likes hanging with them. So he's released, and he gives nothing but good press about the rebels. So the whole thing was a win-win for the rebels. It wasn't about money either. They didn't have any demands. They just wanted to make some news, I think.
That's funny.
Okay, so anyway, so Frank is now working with the CIA in trying to kill the whack the beard, as they said in JFK. He is part of the Bay of Pigs. Now, the Bay of Pigs, in case people don't know, in 1962, is an attempt militarily. It starts under Eisenhower, but will migrate to the Kennedy administration. And what Frank does is he goes to see the leader of Guatemala and the leader of Honduras to get their permission to train the rebels, or the anti-Castro Cubans in this case, in Guatemala and Honduras. And Guatemala agrees to it. And obviously there was some money that exchanged hands. But they create this 2500 brigade. The Brigade 2506 is what it was called. And 25, this is really weird, Brigade 2506, which they will give that flag, by the way, at the Orange Bowl to JFK a few months before he was assassinated, the brigade flag. The brigade, the 2506 Brigade, was designed to start counting at 2500 to deceive Castro into thinking there were at least 2,500 of them. So the first guy who was killed was actually number 2506. He was the first to die, and the 2,500 was made up as a starting point of the brigade, if that makes any sense. And the guy's name was Carlos Santana, if that means anything to anybody. So, yeah, 1962 in December, they give the commander-in-chief their flag, which is that. And Kennedy famously says, "I'm going to hold on to this until we can raise it in a free Havana." That never happens. They will later sue the Kennedy Foundation to get it back. In 1977, I think the brigade had a sue to get it, and they found it in some warehouse just covered with dust and dirt to show you how valuable it was to Kennedy. But the Bay of Pigs, famously, Kennedy calls off the air support. They're abandoned on the beach. Most of them are captured. Some of them are executed by Castro and his men. And he will then get reparations, $2.3 million in reparations, and something like $53 million in pharmaceutical and aid from the United States government in exchange for the releasing of these prisoners to go back to Miami, by the way. So the ones who were executed, and this is a weird thing, the ones who were executed were not, nobody had ever done this from what I understand in the world. Castro, when he executed them in front of firing squads, did not offer them blindfolds. He offered them gags. They were gagged with the gag that was ostensibly the blindfold, because they would be screaming profanities at Castro, and he didn't want his men to hear it, who were doing the shooting. And they gagged them and executed them with gags in their mouths, Eric, instead of blindfolds. Now, that is a bit of oddity. That is really weird, because the first series of men went out cursing and screaming, saying F you to Castro, Che Guevara, and the revolution. And he didn't want his own men to hear that, Eric. That was a little weird.
He didn't like bad press.
Well, it wasn't going to get out anywhere. I mean, it was kind of like at a firing squad in Cuba. You know, it's not like anyone's going to hear this, but
it's still a threat to him, though, because they could say something that psychologically could get his men to turn on him later. So it's not completely crazy.
Well, it's not as crazy as the Bay of Pigs, because they believe that the people in Cuba are going to rise up when the landing assault starts. And originally, the place that they had planned to do the invasion was in a mountainous area that had the most anti-Castro Cubans on the island. That area was changed at the last minute for reasons that nobody understood to the Bay of Pigs. So when they landed, they already had spies and everything else knowing where they were coming. So they were sitting ducks. But the spies originally said that they were supposed to come on the other side of the island that had a lot of anti-Castro Cubans. So the idea was not insane that they would rise up, if you could. I can't really see that. But the Bay of Pigs, Eric was down there in Guantanamo, so he knows the island better than me. But
not really.
Oh, okay.
I was over in the bottom. I mean, I was in Guantanamo. That's it. There's a DMZ and there was a dump there. And if you went off the highway, you'd get your ass blown up because there were landmines completely across the DMZ between Gitmo and Cuba proper.
Wow. Well, oh, by the way, the mobster was named Gaspar Magadino, and he was a professional hitman for the mob. But Johnny Roselli comes in, as we mentioned before. And Roselli, his plot was to put this poison into a milkshake at the Havana Hilton bar that Castro went to. And the soda jerk got nervous, started sweating. He had the milkshake prepared with the poison. It was in the refrigerator. And he took it out and he got scared and put it back in the refrigerator and did not have the nerve to kill Castro. That was Johnny Roselli's plot, by the way. The soda jerk was executed, unfortunately, for him. So these plots begin to multiply, and a lot of them involve just weird CIA ideas. But there is a salvage company that Frank Sturgis forms, and it's not for salvage, it's for undersea explosives. And he operates out of his home in Coral Gables in Florida. And they go underneath a ship filled with ammunition in Havana Harbor, and they blow it to smithereens. And that kills about 75 Cubans, by the way, who are on the dock. This is a huge story, because Che shows up at the funeral the next day and he's wearing the beret, and that's where Alberto Corda takes the famous, iconic photo of Che Guevara that a lot of people wear on T-shirts to this day. That iconic photo was taken at the funeral for these dead. It was a French ship, La Coubre. It was loaded with munitions, and the photo was taken at that time. Now, we kind of did a different take on that, I think. In 1972, we did our own version of that at Lampoon called Is Anything Sacred? This is Che Guevara with the iconic photo being pied in the face by the legendary yippie Aaron Kay, who in 1977, Aaron Kay was the pie man, and he would pie people. He famously, that's the iconic photo. Yeah, that was taken at the ceremony funeral for the dead 75 Cubans in that attack. It destroyed a lot of munitions. Frank was very successful in that attack. It killed 75 others, but he was photographed there, and that becomes the iconic photo of him. He will later be killed in Bolivia by Bolivian police, but Felix Rodriguez, who was on recently, I guess, with Tucker, talked about cutting off his hands and sending them back as a commemorative item to whoever who received them.
I don't know. I said charming.
Oh yeah. Somebody got his wristwatch. I mean, it's really macabre what they were doing, but the situation becomes that Frank is doing these post Bay of Pigs things that are now considered violations of the Neutrality Act, because Kennedy, in his dealings with Cuba after the Bay of Pigs and because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, guarantees the Soviets hands-off policy against the invasion of the island of Cuba ever again. Now, not everybody knows that. So one of them, who doesn't give a shit, is Frank Sturgis and his anti-Castro Cubans in Miami. And they continue these run-and-gun assaults on the island. And one of them, interestingly enough, having nothing to do with Cuba, was an operation called Operation Sword that he was involved in. And if you remember when the Pueblo was taken in North Korea, Eric, it was 1968. You were too young, but there was a captain named, a commander named Lloyd Bucca, I think his name was. They were being held hostage by the North Koreans. The Pueblo was a spy ship. Well, he puts together a group, Sturgis, and gets himself a boat. This is in October 1968. He gets 13 men. and they find off the coast of Cuba a trawler, a Russian trawler that they determined through the CIA is a spy ship, and they are going to capture this Russian spy ship off the coast of Cuba to swap for the USS Pueblo that's being held in North Korea. Just crazy stunts. He ended up grounding the ship in British Honduras, and the British arrested him. He will later be released by the British with a call from the CIA. He also buys a twin-engine Piper Apache. He's flying over Cuba. He's got a printing press in his house. He's dropping all kinds of tens of thousands. Yeah, this is his plane. He flies over and drops tens of thousands of leaflets all the time. And in the leaflets, it says how to make bombs and how to form guerrilla groups and how to fight back against Castro. This goes on for a number of years with him. In fact, the entire operation goes on for years. He is obsessed with anti-communism and will not stop trying to get rid of Castro. In fact, he will land on literally minuscule mountain airstrips to help the guerrilla movement against Castro that forms post-Castro's reign of terror. He will then work with the CIA and do some of these other programs. Now, this is all before Watergate. He's known as Chief Crazy Horse by the anti-Castro Cubans. That's his nickname because he's so nuts. But that being said, he will then get involved in other countries. He will then try to topple Papa Doc in Haiti. He will be involved in the assassination of Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. Generally speaking, what happened was we would install these dictators to stave off Castro's spreading communist movement in the Caribbean. This is what happened, and this is generalization, but we would back these dictators, and then the dictators would get out of control, and we would remove the dictators and try to install democracy in all of these different islands. It was the same thing. We would put in a brutal guy. The guy would go completely megalomaniacal like Trujillo, and then we'd have him removed. And Trujillo's case, Frank sent the arms to a supermarket in Santo Domingo, which was, he had changed the name to Trujillo City because he was such a megalomaniac. So this supermarket is filled with arms, and Trujillo is assassinated by 2 carloads of men, like a dozen guys shooting nonstop until he was shredded. This was not one man with a rifle. When they killed you in Central and South America, it was not one guy. It was usually a bunch of guys. And this was a specific example, the execution of Trujillo. Now, he tries to get Baby Doc in Haiti, Papa Doc, Duvalier, and he's dropping like 55-gallon drums of gasoline onto the palace, trying to kill Baby Papa Doc from the B-25 that he bought for Castro back in the day. He steals the B-25 and the C-46. This is Trujillo, by the way. He was called General Bottle Cap because he had so many medals that the children on the island would get bottle caps and put them on their clothing to copy Trujillo's medals that he would have, these meaningless medals. So he forms this company called the Hampton Roads Salvage Company in Florida. And from there, he will go out and do all of these different things. Now he's got funding.
That's weird.
What?
That's a weird. I live in Hampton Roads.
No, so I know.
It's reaching back to his youth, I guess.
Yeah. And it's in Coral Gables, and yeah, he constantly goes back there because his family's there, Eric, in Virginia. So he's in the paper a lot, even in Virginia, like, Local Boy Does Good. His handler is a guy. 3 guys leave with him. These 3 brothers leave Cuba with him. One of them flying one of the planes, and his name is Sam Jennis. Now, Sam Jennis is really a name for Joaquin Sanginés and the Sanginet brothers. There's three of them. Joaquin, I forgot the other two, but Joaquin Sanginés, aka Sam Genis, becomes his CIA handler, Eric. And Genis will also flee Castro's Cuba and will be part of the Bay of Pigs. Now, the Bay of Pigs prisoners are released through JFK's negotiation with them, and they're turned back. But the $2.3 million in reparations is the first time a capitalist country has ever given reparations to a communist country. And Castro really toots his horn over extracting this at the last minute. By the way, when Sturgis is doing these runs in his Cadillac from Miami to Cuba, he dresses as a priest, and he wanted to be a priest before he got into the army. He said if it wasn't for World War II, he would have joined the priesthood, which I found to be very interesting. You hear that a lot. You heard that from David Ferry, who also flew planes over Cuba. He wanted to be a priest. There's a lot of this priest stuff, guys switching jobs to, being in the CIA and the Jesuits and everything else. A lot of it came out of the Jesuits. He also went to a parochial school. I don't know if it was Jesuit, though. I know he went to Catholic school, Italian Catholic. But anyway, this is the reason I mention all this. This is all before Watergate. This is all before the break-in at the Chilean embassy. This is all before the break-in of Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist, Lewis Fielding. The situation, he gets a call one day, and they say that it's Bernard Barker, and Barker's telling him they're putting a group together for national security to break into some places. And the thing that Frank Sturgis believed the Watergate break-in was about, and the reason he wanted to do it was they believed that money was coming to the DNC from Castro's Cuba, because Castro did not want someone who was his arch nemesis, like Richard Nixon, to be elected president of the United States and reelected. So there was a dossier that they were looking for. According to Frank Sturgis, there was a dossier of Democratic recipients of money from Cuba via the Soviet Union. And that was very explosive. And he was into finding that. They had seen a cover page of this, according to Frank Sturgis and Hunt. There was a cover page, and they had information or intel that there was a 132-page single-space document somewhere in DNC headquarters. That was what he thought. Whether that was true or not, I do not know. But he was brought in under the guise of national security. And literally, the law, Nixon was not wrong. Nixon said that they could break into any building in the United States under his orders if national security was at stake. 2 days before Watergate, there was a court case that changed that law, a case that was settled based on having nothing to do with Watergate. By coincidence, it was 2 days before Watergate. But Nixon was correct about doing that for national security. National security legally had a very broad framework, Eric, for presidents, if you know what I'm talking about. You were able to do a lot under the umbrella of national security.
Yeah, I still do.
Right, but it's a lot less because there's been court cases chipping away at it over the past 50 years. But back then, Nixon was not incorrect about the broad powers that he had regarding national security, of doing things like break-ins. And I'll tell you why it starts. It starts because of the Pentagon Papers. It starts because of Ellsberg giving out the Pentagon Papers to everyone. There was rumors, according to Liddy and according to Hunt, that he'd already given them to the Soviet Union, and that he was by that guise being a spy and a traitor, could be subject to the Espionage Act. And we're going to do an Ellsberg episode, so I don't want to get too big into Ellsberg, but he does feel, Nixon, Hunt, Liddy, et al., that Ellsberg has violated numerous laws, and the Supreme Court is holding up printing of the Pentagon Papers because the New York Times has them via Ellsberg, who's now given them to everybody, including High Times, I think. So while this is going on, they decide to try to get dirt on Ellsberg so they can fight back. They do not know what else he's going to give out. They do know that he worked for the Rand Corporation, and the paper on the war that Nixon wants has been stolen from our own National Archives. It's been stolen from the Rand Corporation, and the only place that has this document is the Brookings Institute, which is a liberal democratic think tank. And he doesn't want to say anything, Nixon, because he feels that if Brookings knows that he wants it, then he's never going to get it. So they come up with this idea of setting fire to the Brookings Institute. This was a Chuck Colson idea, setting fire to the Brookings Institute and having Liddy and Hunt go in there during the fire dressed as firemen and to get these documents that Nixon wants from the Brookings Institute's files. That is eventually called off, and Kissinger says it's a bridge too far. It's totally insane. However, what they do agree to do is to break into the office right here in Beverly Hills of Lewis Fielding, who I always call Lewis Fielding Mellish. Obviously, Fielding Mellish, the character played by Woody Allen in Bananas, the famous comedy version of the Castro takeover of Cuba. If anybody wants to see the comedy version, you could have a weekend of Che by Soderbergh and Bananas by Woody Allen, because some of the shots, obviously Bananas was filmed way before Soderbergh's Che, but some of the shots and uniforms are exactly the same. It's really funny. But nevertheless, they feel that inside the office of Lewis Fielding, who is a top psychiatrist in Beverly Hills, that Ellsberg is seeing, because Ellsberg, it's revealed, has a lot of peccadillos. I won't get into them because we'll get into them in the Ellsberg episode, but Nixon feels that he's a freak, a sexual freak. And when Nixon gets onto sexual freaks, he really gets excited. My famous, everybody's got their favorite things from the Watergate tapes. There's two of my favorite things. Oh, there's three. Oh, there's the Bananas. Yeah, dude. I mean, it opens up with Howard Cosell interviewing the deposed dictator who's lying dead on the steps of the Capitol, as he does it as a pro fight. Like the fighter's been knocked out. Just brilliant. Woody Allen's first movie. But some of my favorite stuff on the tapes about Nixon saying we could raise the money, we can get the $1 million. The amount of money that he can raise to pay off Hunt is a favorite. The conversation that he has with Haldeman about the Chicago 7, they're all Jews. All of them are Jews. Every single one of them. Reuben, Hoffman, they're all Jews. They're all out to get me. His anti-Semitic stuff is great stuff. But there's one that I forgot, and it's him talking to Haldeman. And part of the storyline that I'm going to get into is the death of J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover's death leads to which nobody ever talks about, leads to a massive power vacuum in American politics when he dies in 1972. And a lot of Watergate is caused by the death of J. Edgar Hoover, because a powerful J. Edgar Hoover would have snuffed this out from day one, but he was ill and he died in 72. And then there's a power struggle, as we now know, at the FBI with Mark Felt fighting with L. Patrick Gray, the Nixon appointee, and there's that battle royale. But the death of Hoover leads to a power vacuum in the intelligence community in the United States. And his funeral, which Nixon orders to be in the rotunda, the Capitol, is the target of the anti-war demonstrators. 250,000 of them descend on Washington, and they're going to disrupt the funeral. The intelligence of the CIA informs Liddy and Hunt and the White House that they're planning to get inside the rotunda and literally open the casket and drag the body out of the casket of J. Edgar Hoover. Oh, you didn't know this, did you? So, no. So they send a squad of Hunt and Frank Sturgis to infiltrate the, and this is asked by Nixon. This is in between the two break-ins of the Watergate. The first failed break-in and the second failed break-in. There's protest, anti-war protest at the Capitol And it's not because of Hoover, but it happens to be Hoover being lying in state in the rotunda. So Frank Sturgis and Hunt and Barker and Liddy are sent to disrupt the protesters. So they get to the Capitol steps, and the protesters try to get up the stairs. And Sturgis, to his credit, a guy who is a priest, raises a fist to hit Sturgis, and Sturgis cold cocks him, and he goes tumbling down the stairs of the Capitol. And it turns out the next day it's Daniel Berrigan, the radical priest who, with his brother, had burned all the draft files, had broken into the draft board and burned all the draft records, and were radical Catholic priests. And the guy had a broken face from Frank Sturgis, who punched him in the nose and in the face when he tried to get up the stairs to get to Hoover's body, which made Nixon very happy and made Haldeman very happy that Sturgis had done this. And it was in the paper. It didn't say Frank Sturgis, but Berrigan was in the paper the next day saying he was attacked by a pro-Nixon sympathizer. But the best quote by Nixon about Hoover is on the tapes. And I'm just going to tell you what he says. It's one line, and he just says, and I'll do it as the best I can. He goes, "That old cocksucker was a morally depraved son of a bitch." And that's on the tapes that anybody could hear at the Nixon Library, him talking to Haldeman on the death of J. Edgar Hoover with photos that, sorry about that, he was aware of the photos that the mob had and that he was compromised and everything else that we'll get into, at some point. But this leads to the actual break-in of the Watergate by Sturgis, Barker. Martino is a close friend of Sturgis. Martino is Muscolito. He was another strong man. Is this one of the Berrigans? I don't know what Daniel.
Yeah, this is Daniel Berrigan.
Okay, yeah. So this is the one. Look at this guy. You didn't want to punch this guy in the face. So
I thought it was a good shot.
That's a great shot. These guys were so full of shit. Anyway, so he that was in May of 1972, by the way, I think. But the Operation Sword thing, which we got into, was the last thing. So before Watergate, but he has a huge post-Watergate career, which I'll touch on after we get through Watergate. But for the break-in part of it, he kind of smells a rat. Why this guy is there, he thinks it's to get these documents, and he figures, I'm going to go with Barker, and I'm going to go with Martino. Hunt, we know, is Eduardo from the Bay of Pigs. He trusts Hunt. The only guy they don't know is James McCord. And that's the rat that actually pulls the plug on him. James McCord, and he goes through this in detail, how James McCord, put the tape on the door on the outside horizontally instead of vertically, so you couldn't see it when the door was closed. They had Gonzalez with them. Gonzalez owned a lock store in Miami. Gonzalez was CIA. Martino was CIA. Sturgis was CIA. And Hunt was CIA. All of these guys were CIA, except for McCord. McCord had been an FBI agent. He was still CIA, and they didn't know it. And he was reporting to his handler twice a week before and after this. So they did not know about McCord, and they were sandbagged. And the whole thing is a setup to get caught. And McCord is disappearing during the entire operation. They're just going, "Where's McCord?" All of a sudden, he's got to go to Radio Shack to get batteries and wires for his really shitty eavesdropping equipment that everyone was going, "This is what you're getting?" In other words, Eric, if you saw somebody who said they were an IT expert and they came back with a Dixie cup and a string or an orange juice can, and you just said, "What is this, bro?" Like, "What's the deal here?" And he disappears to go to literally the spy shop on Virginia Avenue in DC or wherever it is to buy more spy equipment during the break-in, Eric. During the break-in, he's running back and forth. He goes, "I need batteries." And they're going like, "Dude, what the fuck are you doing? We're in the middle of this thing." So Sturgis says the rule of thumb is anybody ever feels nervous and in one of these break-ins, you could call it off. And he says, "Look, this ain't working. Something doesn't seem right. Let's bail." and he's overruled by Hunt, who stupidly says, "Nah, let's just get this over with already. Come on, this is twice we did this." And his instincts were correct, Sturgis, because the whole thing was a setup. They get arrested by an intelligence officer for the DC police. We covered this guy last week. They guns drawn. Sturgis famously said, "Just be careful, be cool. Nobody's got weapons on him." He calms the guy down. It was all hopped up. And when they get into the paddy wagon, Sturgis says his name is Frank Hamilton, and he's the attorney for these men. He makes believe he's the men's attorney, and the cops don't. That was pretty bold. I didn't know that, in the paddy wagon and in the police station for the burglary. But the cops don't buy it, and they just arraign them as regular, burglars anyway. They know that something's wrong. Why do they know something's wrong? Because they're arraigned at night. And during the arraignment, they're told inside the police van, they're told by James McCord, "Nobody say anything. They're going to get us out of this. This is a no-brainer. Don't worry about it. Nobody talk. We'll be cool." And they go, "All right, what do we know? I mean, this has happened before." They figure they're going to get sprung. And they get to court, and everybody says, they all have assumed names. They have phony IDs. And he says, "Stick with your IDs." And he goes, "Okay." So they gets to McCord, and he says, "What do you do?" He says, "I work for the CIA." So they're going like, what? Like he tells them he works for the CIA in open court, unprovoked, Eric, unprovoked. But and the judge goes, "What did you say?" He goes, "Yeah, I work for the Central Intelligence Agency." And they go, and then that's where Douglas Caddy is in the audience, and that's where that we see Woodward. And Woodward is tipped to go down there. Woodward hears the CIA thing. This is the point I'm trying to make. The next morning in the paper is the first article written by Woodward and Bernstein on Watergate. That's a Sunday edition. I think it's like July 19th, whatever that Sunday was, the day after the Watergate break-in, day after the arraignment, rather. And Woodward has the entire background of one guy, like they did with Oswald, of Frank Sturgis. Every single thing in the episode that we discussed is in this article about Frank Sturgis. How they got that information overnight is not possible. Is not possible. It was the same thing they did with Oswald. They had the entire bio of Frank Sturgis in this first article here, as opposed to any of these other cats. And the other guys, in the article, it said their phony cover was what they did for a living. In other words, Gonzalez had a lock shop, a key and lock store in Miami. Martino worked as a furniture salesman. They get to Frank Sturgis. It says soldier of fortune, fought against Castro. All the crap that we've been talking about is in an article in 24 hours on Frank Sturgis. And Sturgis goes, "What the fuck?" Everybody makes bail except Frank Sturgis. The bail is set at $250,000 for these guys for a simple burglary. And Sturgis can't make the money. He doesn't have it. It literally has to throw down this money. His wife is in Florida, and Barker will eventually go to the anti-Castro Cubans to raise the $5,000 in cash. Keep in mind, this is 1972, 5,000 in cash, Eric, right?
Sure. So a lot more money.
6 times 5, whatever that is, right?
30 now. It'd probably be even more than that in equivalent.
Probably 8 times. Anyway, so he has to go in the DC jail. He's been in a lot of jails. He's been in Mexican jails, Guatemalan jails, Honduran jails, Cuban jails. He said that the DC jail, this is 1972, the same place the J6 hostages are right now. He said that jail in 1972, and they're all going to be in there for months, was the second worst prison he's ever been in his life. It was second to the Mexican, which was the worst. And he said this was the second worst. Hunt will go in there. Hunt will famously have to just kill cockroaches nonstop and, just breathe in this urine and vomit air and everything else. And this was all done intentionally by Sirica to make them crack. They're in there for over 6 months apiece in this jail, going to trial. And Sturgis will famously be sentenced to 50 years in prison. Liddy will get 8 to 20. These incredibly draconian sentences. for break-ins for people who actually worked for the United States government, who were literally following orders. It's a little much. With huge military records. I mean, the Sturgis, he wrote this long thing to tell the judge his background, and his lawyer read the entire background into the court record about Frank Sturgis, what he'd done, to no avail to Mad Dog Sirica. He will eventually do 14 months. They even brought up, he had gone to Texas at one point, Sturgis, I think we covered this last week, and begins sending stolen cars down to Mexico to raise money for weapons to fight against Castro. Some wannabe prosecutor in Miami who wants to jump on this Watergate bandwagon brings this up against Sturgis in the middle of the thing. Sturgis is charged with this stolen car ring, and the DEA comes out and says, no, he was working for us, you piece of shit. And those charges are dropped. So there are people working on Sturgis's behalf, and Sirica just says, I don't care. The FBI comes out and backs him. The probation officer backs him. The DEA backs him. The CIA, it's ridiculous that this guy and the rest of them are sentenced to these insane sentences. You know, if you want to go after the higher ups, that's one thing. But these guys were, breaking into an office. I mean, give me a break. Give me a break. Anyway, they are incarcerated. He finally raises bail money, goes back to Florida. He's kind of shredded because when he got out of the Army, he had what's now called PTSD. I think back then it was called hysterical neurosis, kind of shell shock. And he did 30 days or 60 days in a mental hospital. But Sirica has him tested for mental stability, and he comes out with flying colors. And he also tested at a 127 IQ, which is not that shabby for a guy who's supposed to be this muscle man of the group. The real muscle man was Martinez, who was known as Muscolito, who was a muscle man. And they all end up together in this jail, and they stay together as a group in the jail. It was kind of interesting. The cells are next. What's that?
Liddy as well, or?
Yeah, at the beginning. Yeah. Liddy is there. Liddy, when he is brought in, when Sturgis comes in, he says, where's Liddy? And he said, Liddy is in the hole. Somebody stole his hairbrush and comb, and Liddy got into a fight with him and beat the crap out of the guy. And they stole. It's in the memoir of Sturgis. It's also in Hunt's memoir. But Liddy will get out of the hole and will eventually end up in Danville, Connecticut. They all end up in Danville, medium security prison, when they finally are sentenced. But Sirica will not let them off the hook. And there is really no wiggle room that he is willing to do anything at this point. But I'll tell you this. When he gets out of prison, he does the 14 months or 15 months Sturgis. He gets out of prison. What does he do? He goes right back to what he was doing before. He goes to Angola and begins fighting in Angola, Eric. And he begins training anti-communist guerrillas in Angola, in the bush, to overthrow this communist leader of Angola. Very similar story. They had thrown off the colonial cloak of Portugal, and they had a guy in there who went megalo, and he was involved in toppling this guy in Angola. So he doesn't stop. The second he gets out of jail, he then goes to Honduras. Reagan's administration takes him under their wing in 1981, Eric. The Angola stuff is in 1979. Castro, for the people who don't realize this, Castro sent 30 to 50,000 soldiers to fight in Africa to spread communism through Africa. And we had to put a stop to it. Jimmy Carter didn't want to get involved, but Reagan did. And this is right before the transition into the Reagan administration, 1979. Sturgis goes over there to train the rebels how to fight against this dictator in Angola. In 1981, he goes to Honduras to train the Contras, Eric, on how to overthrow the Sandinistas for the Reagan administration. So now he's working in another administration. He's out of jail. In '89, he will visit with Yasser Arafat in Tunis for the CIA to find out what Yasser Arafat wants, in terms of Israel. So again, this is not a one-note fiddler. This is a guy who has a huge place in American history, and yet he is relegated to this Watergate break-in storyline. And that's why I wanted to do the 2 episodes, because there's so much of Frank Sturgis that nobody's ever heard about this guy other than he was, one of the convicted Watergate burglars. The amount of stuff that he did, just for Cuba alone, he did 150 air assaults and 60 boat incursions into Cuba over the course of his career. This is just him with Cuba. This is not official government stuff. This is just him. Now, did he give a gun to Arthur Bremer to kill George Wallace? We may never know. We may never know. Was he killed by cancer? We may never know. 2 weeks before, he was training these guerrillas in the Everglades in Florida. He was training guerrillas. He had a group in Florida. And he got a bug bite on the back of his shoulder. And it didn't go away. And he went back to the Everglades, and he came back and he said, I got another one of these bug bites on the back of my shoulder. Goes in the hospital, and in 3 days dies of stomach cancer in 1993. And apparently people believe that it was a dart used by anti-American forces for Castro, who used this KGB blowgun dart, which had a cancer-causing toxin on it that hit him in the back on 2 occasions in the Everglades the final week of his life. There was no autopsy for Frank Sturgis. He immediately died of stomach cancer within 3 days. It was highly, highly suspect. And there was more stuff, like in 1980, Mark David Chapman kills John Lennon at the Dakota. I don't know if you remember the assassination of John Lennon by Mark David Chapman. Well, the doorman for the Dakota was a guy named Sam Jennis. And Sam Jennis, as I mentioned earlier, was his CIA handler, Joaquin Sanjanez. He was the doorman at the Dakota building the night that Mark David Chapman. Yes. There's a lot more to Frank Sturgis than I can ever get my mind around. The Arthur Bremer gun story has never been resolved. The CIA handler doorman regarding Mark David Chapman at the Dakota, who was the overseer of Sturgis, has never been resolved. I know that Lennon was a thorn in the side of a lot of people on the conservative right here in the United States for his anti-war activity. In fact, Frank told the Rockefeller committee that when he left Cuba, he took about $3,000 to $4,000 with him, but in reality, it was $750,000, which he used not for him. I mean, he never took any money from the CIA. He never took any money to be a soldier of fortune. In fact, he hated the name soldier of fortune because there was no fortune, and he never used any of the money for anything other than buying weapons and planes and doing stuff and paying his men. This guy was a true believer, and he believed in anti-communism to the day he died. He never stopped doing what he was doing since he was in World War II. The amazing story of Frank Sturgis is that he never deviated from his anti-communist beliefs. And he did this all over the world, whether the CIA acknowledged him or not, whether he was a contract employee of the CIA or not. He continued to do this work until the day he died. And he was probably killed by Castro forces. Now, what we saw last week with Geraldo, and the reason they trotted out Frank Sturgis at the end in the 70s is not the end, it's 20 years later, is his end. But in the 70s, the late 70s, when they trotted him out, it was to spin the Castro killed Kennedy false disinformation, Eric. That's the interviews that he gives for everyone. He is called before the House Assassinations Committee. He's called before the Rockefeller Commission, and he gives testimony, and the testimony and the interviews and the articles and everything else are all designed to lay the blame of the Kennedy assassination at the foot of Fidel Castro. Nobody buys it, but that's what he's doing. Those were his marching orders at that time. And he went out there and did a lot of TV. And Marita Lorenz will famously say that he was involved in the assassination himself. He denies that, of course, and says he knows who was. And then he goes into this Castro thing, which is just a crazy long-winded story. But I think that's what he was being ordered to do at that time, was to spin this thing that Castro had killed Kennedy through the KGB. And that story never really stuck. No matter how many times the CIA tried to spin that story, it never really stuck with the American people. It was just too far-fetched.
Funny how he's still representing them after he's already served time, though.
I know, dude. I know. It's crazy.
It's very suspect. It's like, whoa. He's still good enough. You're okay with this?
Right. I mean, it's unbelievable. Now, granted, he does 14 months. He does it, easily. He does the 14 months in Danville easily. And then he's back out on this. What?
A felon clearance? I'm just saying.
Oh, he got cleared a million times because he got caught gun running a bunch of times by U.S. government officials. He gets caught by the INS. He gets caught by border security, border patrol. He gets caught, and he's always released. He's always released. When he's caught with the ship by the British officials in Honduras trying to get the Russian trawler, he's immediately released. The fact that he doesn't have a T-shirt that says, "I worked for the CIA," people don't believe it.
No, he has a phone number.
Right. Well, his handler, like I said, it's weird that Hunt and would never acknowledge that he knew him. It was just a bridge too far. It was just silly until his death. Hunt does acknowledge it at the end of his life, and as does Richard Helms in the case of Hunt versus the Liberty Lobby that Mark Lane brought against Hunt. Richard Helms testifies under oath that Frank Sturgis was a contract agent for the CIA.
Wow.
Anyway, I just thought there was enough here for 2 parts, and the guy deserves it because he's such an American hero. And he was a guy who was maligned and by people like Sirica and others, but the guy was a true believer in anti-communism. And if we had more Frank Sturgises today, I don't think we'd be in the position that we're in right now, is the point of the show.
True. Kind of funny, though, how roles seem to be reversed so consistently.
Mm-hmm.
The ones being maligned are the ones who are believers. The ones who are
well, the use of jail by these weak people as a weapon is demonstrated during Watergate. The use of incarceration is, again, their weapon of choice to intimidate people, because I think it's their biggest fear, is being jailed themselves. Liddy goes in and takes over the prison. Liddy goes in and kicks ass. He gets the warden, as you could see our Liddy episode, it'll explain itself.
Definitely.
He literally undermines the warden of the prison he's in because the warden is trying to do nasty things to Liddy. He takes control of the place. Hunt does the same thing in a lot of ways. And Sturgis is not even fazed by being in prison. But it's the fear of the left that they will end up in prison. As we now see this hysterical Trump is coming for them craziness that is going on, even with Rachel Maddow last night saying she's going to be in an internment camp. This is their fear. Their loss of their freedom is their biggest fear. But the people on the right, the people who are militarized, who have been doing this their whole lives, Frank Sturgis was bullwhipped by Batista forces in El Moro. Right.
And Liddy, famously would just sit there with a lighter under his hand, just like,
right. But even Hunt says in his memoir, he knew Liddy for years and years and years. They tried to paint Liddy as a nut. He was anything but a nut. Hunt.
Well, I mean, he was a badass.
No, absolutely a badass, absolutely. Yeah. But they try to paint him as a wacko. I was just watching Gaslit, like I said, with Sean Penn and Julia Roberts and some other people in it, and the Liddy character is, of course, portrayed as a nut. and it was anything but a nut. They believed the revolution was in full swing, not unlike today. And, there were so many things happening when they had the March on Washington. They had, guards around the Oval Office, within the White House itself, in the hallways, in case the doors were breached by the protesters who vowed to get in there. They put, as you know, they put buses surrounding the White House, dozens and dozens of buses as a wall against the protesters. I mean, they thought this was it. They thought this was 1917. Liddy thought it, Nixon thought it, Haldeman thought it. You have to see it from their eyes to see what was going on with 250,000 people in the streets of D.C. Very interesting, and Pat Buchanan covers it very well in his book.
Well, it's obviously a fantastic story, and we'll have Hunt coming up.
Hunt is coming up. Interestingly enough, they left the money in the Holiday Inn in the rooms, the sequential $100 bills that they had, and the burglars had a couple of hundred each on them. The numbers were in sequence, as we talked about last week. James McCord had 36 cents on him. Think about that. James McCord famously did not have any of the money. He had 36 cents in change in his pockets. A grown-ass man. Wow. Yeah. We'll get into McCord because we got his book now, and not that the book is going to reveal anything. I've glanced at it. I haven't read the whole book. It's called A Piece of Tape, and I guess a statement about the tape on the door. But he seems to think that all of these other guys were evil except him, which may be his point of view as to why he ratted them out.
Nobody's a villain. Nobody's a villain in their own story.
Right.
So, I mean, that's
right. But he's a villain to the rest of them.
Yeah.
He is a villain. Every one of them said the same thing. This guy was the biggest weasel in the world, and he did us in.
Wow. Amazing. All right, well, we've got some super chats that are going to help prop us up. We've got Emily Leidy, who's a new member. And good old Pamela Clifton came in with $10. Happy Tuesday, guys.
Happy Tuesday.
RFK Jr. Trey Ellswick. St. John Hunt said in several interviews Sturgis was his godfather and spent a lot of time around when he was a kid.
Absolutely true. But again, Hunt denies knowing him up until Watergate. That's kind of crazy.
Yeah, it is. Untold stories tying Watergate to D.B. Cooper?
I don't think so, bro. Thanks for the money.
Yeah. Warrior Big Mouth. The Marine Raiders were reestablished in 2006.
Yeah. You know what? I read that, and I didn't know what to make of it, whether it was the same thing or not. But thanks for saying that. I've heard that. I didn't know it was true.
Yeah, I mean,
and I don't know what their role is. That being said, there's some controversy about what their role actually is within the Marines.
All right. Lynn Blechtstein has been a member for 10 months. Do any of these Watergate guys know Oswald?
Well, that's kind of the debate with Sturgis and Hunt. We're going to get into that because turns out the two of them might have been in Dallas on November 22nd. I mean, Marita Lorenz claims that Sturgis met with Oswald in Miami a couple of weeks before the assassination. Nobody believes Marita Lorenz, but nevertheless, it's out there.
Wow. Jason Willis said, I love everyone in chat and worship Eric and Mark. Okay, thank you. Lynn Bleckstein, Grodin's signed book is priceless. The $100 cost is worth every penny. Everyone should buy a copy. Also bought the assassination DVD. My blues song of the day is Sweet Home Chicago by Robert Johnson.
Bleckstein, I'm glad you got the book finally, because everybody was driving us crazy about getting the book. I told you it was worth the wait, and nobody believed me. Now they're getting the book.
Look at his profile picture.
What's that?
Look at his profile picture.
Is the cover of the book? Or
yeah.
Oh, that's cool. Book. Yeah, Sweet Home Chicago is interesting by Robert Johnson, but there's also Sweet Home Alabama, and said there's a line in there about Watergate that you may want to look at in Sweet Home Alabama.
Yep. And that Fletcher boy, Liddy didn't snitch. Inmates respected him. Yeah,
they respected all of them. Yeah, they respected Liddy and also Hunt and obviously Sturgis and Martinez. Martinez was all of them were protected inside by themselves. So nobody messed with these guys because they weren't considered criminals. They were considered that the government stuck it to them and that they were not in there for anything else but political reasons. So nobody really hassled them.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, Sturgis, Liddy, these guys are badasses who could kill you with their bare hands. I mean, I'm sure the normal prisoners are not equipped to deal with mercenaries who've gone all over the world. Like I couldn't help earlier when you mentioned Sturgis talking about the, everywhere he's locked up. I was thinking the Frank Sturgis Voter's Guide to Jails Around the World.
Right. You know what? They had to help Barker out a bunch of times, though, because Barker was a smaller guy who wasn't really that. Ironically, he was called macho at the age of 5, simply to separate him from his sister. And he may have had some sexual perversions that the inmates did not like, but they kept having to rescue Barker. I think he's there on the right.
Yeah. You can see how much smaller he is.
He got in some trouble, but the rest of them were there with him.
Yeah, I'm sure that definitely helped. Well, this is fantastic. Notice a lot of people were watching. We had over 4,000 people watching at one point between all the different platforms.
Wow.
Almost.
Well, this guy deserves it. I mean, this guy, Frank Sturgis, of all the different shows we've done, he's kind of like one of the most unheralded American heroes that we've ever covered. If you want to call him a hero, I don't know. I mean, loses his American citizenship. He gets it back. It's called a Certificate of Loss of Nationality, Eric, to be exact, from the INS. That's the actual title of your status. They give you a Certificate of Loss of Nationality. Now, that was in January 1960. The Immigration Naturalization Service. I don't know how that's possible, but again, this is something that they did to him, and then he regains it later. So that's kind of weird.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. Well, we are going to roll this over and keep the party going at Locals, with Oswald, of course, leading the way. There'll probably be a Panda and friends over there. And as everybody has heard by now, unstructured.locals.com. You can be a member for free. We got a super chat that came in, though. Dorothy Kilgallen wrote about Frank Sturgis in her famous book,
Water Under the Gate. That's funny. That's funny. Well, Jack Ruby was down there doing gun running along with Frank Sturgis. So Sturgis is aware of Ruby's activity down there. And that, I don't know what that has to do with Dorothy Kilgallen, but Jack Ruby does overlap into this, as we covered last week in Frank Sturgis Part 1, which I recommend if you haven't seen Part 1 to take a look at that. It may answer some. There might be some overlaps because I don't remember exactly what we said there, but the connection, the fact that he testifies before a Senate committee behind closed doors in 1958, I found to be really interesting. That it goes back that far. You know what I mean? 1959. Think about it, July 15, 1959. This is not a guy just who's a soldier of fortune, bro. Of people who think he was a soldier of fortune, that's erroneous. That's erroneous. And then October 22nd, 1959, Castro famously severs relations with the United States, as Sturgis had predicted.
And he was right.
He was right. Yeah. In fact, he explains the split between Che and Castro as being split between Maoism and Soviet-style communism. That Che wanted the more radical Maoist communist Chinese communism, and Castro famously wanted the Soviet style.
Well, Che makes Castro look like a piker. I mean, Che was a nasty operator.
Right.
Every part of him was actually nasty. It's so frustrating to see him on the t-shirts because Not only was he a stone cold killer,
yeah,
but he also was allergic to bathing, allergic to I mean, he was a filthy, disgusting, horrible human being who
well,
loved
I'll
to kill
just say
people.
this: 1 month before the Bay of Pigs, and keep in mind, Frank Sturgis was involved in the training of the anti-Castro Cubans and the forces for the Bay of Pigs. 1 month before, I think it was March 14th, 1961, his U.S. citizenship was restored in lieu of the Bay of Pigs, which is about to happen. So it's kind of interesting. They said, "Oh boy, we got to take care of this guy. He's, he's going in and doing all this stuff, and a lot of the training. You see a scene in JFK with David Ferry when they're training down by Lake Pontchartrain and in the swamps where they're training. That's for the Bay of Pigs 2, the event that didn't happen because of the Neutrality Act, where you see the FBI arresting David Ferry and the FBI is arresting all the different people training there in the swamps. That was the event that JFK and Bobby Kennedy prevented from happening. And that was a second Bay of Pigs that never occurs.
Amazing. Well, we're going to keep the conversation going over at Locals. I hope everybody heads over there. There's a link in the description, and we'll see you there momentarily.